You would say that also of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which are widely assumed to have been an example of a war that ended as a result of nuclear weapons, and you've challenged that.
Well, the emperor says that as the war ends, he says in his surrender announcement, we have to surrender because of nuclear weapons. And the Americans immediately jump on that and say, ha, it was us, we did it, it worked. And there's good reasons for the Americans to want nuclear weapons to have been the thing that won the war. After all, if they didn't, if it was the Soviet invasion, then the Soviets have to get credit for winning the war. U.S. influence and military prestige doesn't increase. I mean, there are all kinds of reasons. But what's often overlooked is that the Japanese have a reason for saying that the bomb won the war as well. If you are Hirohito and you've just led your country into a disastrous war and the cities are in ruins and the army is defeated and the navy is confined to port and the economy is a shambles, what are you going to say? Are you going to say, well, we made mistakes, we didn't fight well, the army and the navy could never coordinate? Or are you going to say, the enemy made this amazing scientific breakthrough that no one could have predicted, and that's why we lost. It wasn't really our fault. And as a matter of fact, if you go back and look closely at the historical record, if you look at the diaries, the contemporaneous factual accounts, what you find is that there's almost no evidence that the bombing of Hiroshima touched off a crisis in Japanese governing circles, and that when the Soviets invade on the same day that Nagasaki is bombed, almost universally, there's uproar and tumult and clear signs of crisis. For instance, on the day that the Soviets invade, the Japanese High Command declares martial law, and that order is put into effect that day. No such order was put into effect 3 days earlier when Hiroshima was bombed. On the day that the Soviets invade, in the Army-only staff meeting that they have before the larger Supreme Council meeting, they talk about overthrowing the emperor and setting up a military dictatorship. No such talks were held 3 days earlier when Hiroshima was bombed. It is difficult to imagine that a historical fact that we're so familiar with and seems so reasonable could not be true. But if you look at the facts, there's just no support for it.
You have also challenged, as have others, the need for huge numbers of weapons for deterrence. In fact, I believe in the early stages of the arms race, some experts took the view that an optimum number of weapons for deterrence was somewhere between 1 and 10, closer to 1. How do you deal with the fact that the whole world now is dealing with tens of thousands of weapons, many of them on hair-trigger alert?
I think that there's no evidence that a weapon that is unlikely to deter works better when you have large numbers of it than when you have small numbers. I mean, essentially, until you have proof that deterrence really works, that you can coerce with nuclear weapons, that they create a profound psychological shock, I don't think that it makes sense to have large arsenals at all. And, there was enormous city bombing in World War II, which in some ways is analogous. The United States and Germany and Great Britain and to some extent others were trying to kill civilians in order to break the will of their opponents. None of them succeeded, but they did manage to kill 1 million extra civilians during the course of the war. And I think that if you have nuclear weapons, that get used in a future war, that is likely what you'll get. You'll get huge numbers of civilians without much military benefit.
With the advent of the Obama administration, there has at last been at least a move or a beginning of a move in some direction toward nuclear disarmament, toward zero. First, do you think zero is possible and desirable? And do you think it can be achieved? Well, Obama himself said it may not be achieved in his lifetime, but you have said, I believe, that you think it may be possible to achieve nuclear disarmament at even zero in your lifetime. How optimistic is that, and why do you say that?
I think that the chief reason that I am optimistic about the possibility of eliminating nuclear weapons is that this conversation about whether nuclear weapons are useful or not is a conversation that we have never had, at least here in the United States, and I don't think in Russia or in other countries. It's a marvelous thing that Obama is pushing this, and I sometimes wonder if he inserts phrases like, "but not in my lifetime," so as not to scare people who want to hold on to nuclear weapons. I think that for 60 years we've had a conversation between idealists and realists, although I think there are problems with the realist position. It's not really realist, but in any case. And that debate has never really budged. And so people feel discouraged. We've had this conversation again and again. We don't get anywhere. You know, why do you think now is different? And I think it's different because we've never had a discussion about, are nuclear weapons really useful in war? Do they really create a special psychological shock that you can use to, you know, coerce people, deter? And if we've never had that conversation, then that's an exciting thing. We can talk about, and I'm confident that if we look at nuclear weapons closely, what we'll find is that yes, they're destructive, yes, they're dangerous, but they're not very useful.
Well, finally, may I ask you what it is that you're working on now, and when might we see the results thereof?
I'm working on a book called New Realism, and the subtitle is not yet determined. But the thrust of it is that we haven't had a realistic look at the usefulness of nuclear weapons yet, and that we need to do that.
Ward Wilson, thank you very much for talking with us now, and I hope that you will join us again and tell us more when the book is out and available.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.